So now it's time, everybody, to relax a little bit. I hope you've had a great day. And I want to do something special for Wednesdays. Hopefully, we'll be able to do this every Wednesday. We're going to do a little traveling into the world of words. It's going to be something that I'm hoping to call Wordsmith Wednesday. And in this case, we're going to talk about filmic entertainment, and we're going to go with the theme for the Outer Limits, just like we do on Fiction Fridays. Let's go with Outer Limits and the control voice, and gets me thinking about working for that show again. Yeah. Here's a book suggestion coming up.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image, make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur, or sharpen it to crystal clarity. For the next hour, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. We repeat, there is nothing wrong with your television set. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits.
All right, Outer Limits, very cool. And as I said, when I worked at the Outer Limits in Vancouver, it was really neat because every time we put the script together, you always have the opening, right? And that comes before the theme. And so you'd write the sort of teaser for the story, and it would have some dramatic beat, and then it would go into the opening. And we got to write what they call the control voice says for that episode, right? So we'd be sitting there, and it was really cool because it actually, in the script, it says control voice. And it just reminded me of all those years I would be a little kid watching the black and white TV, trying to get the UHF station in with the aluminum foil on the rabbit ears, and, and hearing that and seeing that. And that was one of the amazing things, the idea back then of a television in your home where they're controlling what you're seeing. They'll control the vertical. They'll control the horizontal. All those things, that was very chilling. I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, wow, this is pretty wild, right? So on Wordsmith Wednesday for BookTube, for the new YouTube channel and the new Rumble channel, which of course is called Former Star Trek Writing Fellow. I could have called it Former Outer Limits Writing Fellow, but it's Former Star Trek Writing Fellow. We'll talk Star Trek and the inner workings of Star Trek Voyager some other time. I'll tell you about what it was like to hang out with Brandon Braga and stuff like that, who's very pro-liberty, by the way. Good guy. Brandon's a good guy. A lot of good people there. But just want to mention that I have decided on a number of books that I'd like to present to people for various reasons, whether it's because of the writing style or the plots are terrific, or maybe it was turned into a really good movie and I'd like to suggest to you, hey, check out this book because it's a terrific book. And sometimes it combines it all, or it's the ideas behind it, a dystopian book or a series of books we'll put together for dystopian literature, that sort of thing. But I decided I wanted to go with this one specifically because of a time that I got to have when I first went to Outer Limits, and I wrote a letter as part of the many years of communication I had had with Rod Serling's widow, Carol Serling. They met when they were teenagers. My mom went to high school. She was a couple years ahead of Rod Serling in Binghamton High, and she remembered Rod Serling. She knew him, and he used to do little radio plays on the school's loudspeakers at the end of school. They do little radio plays, so he was very creative then. And then he went into the Army, was a paratrooper, had some terrible experiences out in the Pacific. First time he did a drop, the very first time he got deployed, they landed on an island, and the plane that was dropping the supplies dropped it in the wrong spot along the same line as where the paratroopers had dropped. He gets up to collect his parachute. His buddy has landed not too far from him. The crate comes down, lopped his friend's head off. First moment on the ground. decapitated his friend right in front of him. So Rod Serling went through a lot of stuff. He was a boxer and an amazingly talented person. And one of the anecdotes, before I go any deep discussion on any of this stuff at the beginning of this series of videos, and hopefully the channel, is just to mention that, I got to meet Mrs. Serling years later after I had written to her. I used to send stories to Twilight Zone magazine. And as I mentioned before, they would get rejected. I was only 14. But you include a self-addressed stamped envelope to Twilight Zone magazine, which she was the publisher, for which she was the publisher, of which she was the publisher. And she always wrote back. And she put little pencil messages at the top, like, well, we couldn't take this one, but keep trying, And I found out later that the editor of the magazine at that time was one of the most legendary writers of any era of horror, T.E.D. Klein. And if you're not familiar with T.E.D. Klein, look him up. He has a very small amount of work, but I'm going to be talking about him in a future episode of the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel. And it's really interesting to see how all these people who are generations ahead of you influence you. So when I wrote to Carol Serling, I wrote to her when I was I was like 30, and I got the opportunity to work at the Outer Limits. And she remembered me because we had carried on some correspondence here and there after that. And she just was delighted. And then I got to meet her many, many years later on the 50th anniversary of the Twilight Zone at Ithaca College. And it was wonderful. And I got to meet their daughters, and Jody and Ann. And they're amazing, amazing people. And what was really something was that Ann mentioned, and she's written a book all about her relationship with her dad, but she mentioned that even though her father was, one of the most high-profile writers in television history, had so much pressure on him working for Twilight Zone, and then later for Night Gallery, and not really being able to do what he wanted to do with the show and things like that, moving back to New York and, hoping that he could make a go of it there with Night Gallery, essentially moving back to Ithaca. He taught college writing, script writing at Ithaca, and he got to be really good friends with everybody. Loved him there. I met a bunch of people who were friends with him there. And she said that she didn't know he had these French doors in his office, and he had a dictating machine, and he would dictate things, and because that was the most efficient way for him to get things done. Sometimes he'd be working on 2 or 3 scripts in a week, and managing other scripts coming in from people like Bill Nolan. I get to be friends with Bill, or whoever it might be, Richard Matheson, and she said he never looked angry or frustrated or flustered by me. The door would always be open just a little bit, and I would push it in. He'd bring me up on his lap and he'd talk to me. And I just thought, boy, that is the mark of a good person right there, to be that kind to your daughter and spend that time in appreciating his daughter. So with that in mind, I want to go to the inspiration of one of Rod Serling's greatest creations, the film Planet of the Apes, which is my favorite film. And it is Pierre Poul's book, Planet of the Apes. This is a used copy. It's the one that they released after the movie came out. You can see it's got the cover with the back cover with Nova and Taylor, Charlton Heston, of course, playing Taylor, and just a terrific adventure story in the beginning of it. And so I want to talk about the book first. First, let's talk about Pierre Poule, French writer of the World War II era. Pierre Poule had already made his mark with Bridge on the River Kwai, turned into a movie. He was all set at that point, pretty much financially. It's not really for me to say, but he had done very, very well. So he wrote this book, and if people haven't read, if you've seen the movie Planet of the Apes, and it inspired many for the first series of films, then Tim Burton tried to do a remake, and that wasn't so good. And then they've done the other ones recently. And I'm going to discuss those other films, because if you're really, really into Planet of the Apes, you'll notice that in every one of those films, they make intense references to the original movies, sometimes visually and in other ways. So let me give you an example. In the first of the new Planet of the Apes movies with James Franco as the star, and who's the guy? Third, John. I can't remember, but anyway, they have as the main character, James Franco plays a guy named Dr. Rodman. And his girlfriend is named Caroline. And if you take the last 3 letters off of Rodman and Caroline, you get Rod and Carol. Rod Serling and his wife, Carol. So the writers of those movies, and there's tons more, and John Lithgow, that's what I was thinking of. There's tons more in that first of the new series of movies, which sort of parallels a lot of the Planet of the Apes stuff. They combine some elements from a couple, like conquest and battle. They're in their Conquest of the Planet of the Apes and Battle for the Planet of the Apes. They combine a lot of those things. And they even have a reference on a gas station sign in one of the movies later that has the year in which Planet of the Apes was produced. And it shows it's the digits on the sign of a gas station that are still hanging up there in this old derelict gas station. There's tons of stuff in there. So the book, Planet of the Apes, interestingly enough, if you watch the Tim Burton version, formatically, as far as narrative structure goes, that actually fits closer to the way that Pierre Poule wrote this book. And this book, although it looks very, very thin, it's very small print, very, very small print. Okay. And it is a fantastic dystopian story. And it happens on a different planet orbiting around a binary sun system called Betelgeuse. And A Hitchhiker's Guide, Betelgeuse, whatever. But the main character lands on a planet that is inhabited by basically mute humans, just like in the movie, and speaking apes who have a technology and a society and governmental systems and things like that. Now, there's the subtle implication. In fact, it's not even subtle. There is an overt statement that the apes, they're dominant, obviously. The apes use the humans for experiments and things like that. They don't hunt them as they do in the movie. But they use them for experimentations and so on. And there is some secret about what happened on that planet that becomes revealed. The curious thing, there are 2 things about this that are extremely interesting. 3, actually. So Pierre Poule writes this story, and it is a dystopian commentary on too much reliance on technology. Because there's a secret that's being hidden by the apes. And if you're familiar with the Planet of the Apes movie, and spoilers here, big spoilers a lot throughout this conversation here. The spoilers first are that there is a secret, just like Dr. Zaius is holding in the film version, that the humans used to run the planet. And they regressed into basically mute beings because they no longer they became too reliant on the science that they had. They didn't develop anymore. They became lazy and they lost control. And eventually the apes rose up somehow. You don't know exactly how. And then the humans continued to devolve as they were driven out of the cities and the apes took over. And essentially what's happened is the apes have taken over all the technology that the humans developed, but they don't know how to develop anymore. They don't know how to do it. So this human comes and now he can speak. So he's a threat. But what's interesting is in the book, in Pierre Poule's Planet of the Apes novel, the character, who isn't named Taylor, he comes from France. He's a French astronaut. And he becomes a celebrity. And he's actually, he's a celebrity, but there is, just like in the movie, there's a trial because essentially they blame him for a crime because they want to get rid of him. The higher-ups want to get rid of him because he's a threat and he might reveal the secret about this history of the apes, that they're actually not as powerful as they're depicted as being intellectually, that they're actually relying on the technology that those mute animals out there, the humans, developed before they regressed. So that's the secret. And what's curious is they have contemporary technology. They have hovercraft, elevators, escalators, electricity, guns, cars, all that stuff. When they made the movie, Arthur P. Jacobs, Apjack Productions, first of all, there were a couple things about the making of the movie that I'll tell you are quite interesting. And they weren't sure whether they were going to be able to do it properly, so they did a test reel of the makeup. And James Brolin is in the makeup, and they have a number of other actors who are in there, as well as the woman who plays Nova. She actually is in makeup in it, and they showed that they were able to do the makeup properly. So that was a test reel. One of my old professors from Boston University actually bought that original reel, and I was at his apartment in LA. He showed it to me in his apartment against the wall. That was pretty interesting. He also got the robot from Lost in Space. It was going to be thrown out at the 20th Century Fox garage one time, and he saw it, and he got a guy to show up with a pickup truck, and they took it out, and he made thousands of dollars bringing it around to science fiction conventions and stuff. So that was in his living room when I was there. That was pretty interesting too. I mean, for, people who are interested in that curiosity factor, but they couldn't go with the modern technology in the film because they didn't have the budget for it. And I think that actually worked to their advantage, because it made the film timeless. If they had tried to show a futuristic society of apes where they have hovercraft and all these things, it would look very dated for what they thought was modern technology. So the only really cipher or approximation of modern technology you see is the very spare opening of the film, where the character of Taylor is finishing his cigar and ruminating on the state of mankind's ethics and morals. He says, does mankind, this paragon of virtue, still wage war against his brother, still leave his neighbor's child starving? And you'll also notice that they go into hypersleep in the movie. And then he wakes up as they're crash landing on this distant planet, and what they think is a distant planet. And the woman who was with them, her unit has cracked during their trip at near the speed of light. And if you watch The Twilight Zone, there's a story about these guys who steal gold, and they hide out in a cave in cryo-freeze, essentially, so that they can outlive all the people who are chasing them down, and they can use the gold later. And spoilers here, they wake up, and a stalactite has fallen from the ceiling and cracked one of the containers of one of the guys, and he's died. There are only three other guys left. And they're out there in the desert, and they start arguing with each other, trying to port this gold back to a highway. And then in the end of the Twilight Zone episode, you discover that people can manufacture gold now, and gold is essentially worthless. So they did all that for nothing. What's curious about that, of course, is that Rod Serling wrote that script. So in this book, what's really cool is, how Planet of the Apes has that shock ending, okay? And again, spoilers, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm going to give you a spoiler. I just want to let you know that for years, 20th Century Fox put that final image on the box of the Planet of the Apes DVD, which is got to be one of the worst decisions of any corporation ever in history. Ridiculous. You're giving away one of the greatest surprise endings in all of film history. The only thing that could have made it more surprising is if, as he does in the book, the character has to learn a language that the apes speak. What they should have done in Planet of the Apes was start off with the apes speaking a different language with subtitles, and then eventually show Taylor learning their language and somehow being able to write their language. Because that's what happens to this character. He learns the language after he gets caught up in the city of the apes. So let me just give you some spoilers about this, and this is quite interesting. In this book, it opens with spacefaring travelers out on a journey in a solar sail ship. And they find a bottle floating in space. And that acts as a bookend for the internal monologue of the main character. It's his diary in the bottle. So these spacefarers bring it in, then they're reading his narrative. So that's the narrative of the bulk of Planet of the Apes by Pierre Poule. And it's all about his adventures there and so on and so forth. And finally, two ape scientists, Cornelius and Zira, help him escape. They help him get away from these apes that are going to do him in after they put him on trial and he's a big celebrity and stuff like that. And in the book, what's really cool, so I'm going to give you the ending in the book here, so be very careful, okay? So if you're watching this after the fact, skip ahead a couple. In the book, he escapes, comes back to Earth, and he's flying over Paris. He sees the Eiffel Tower. He comes down to the spaceport landing pad, and it's all sort of overground. And of course, he's been traveling near the speed of light, so millions of years have passed for people traveling far below the speed of light. But for him, he's traveling near the speed of light, so time hasn't passed as much for him. There's that parallax problem. So he lands, and there's a Jeep approaching. And you can see sunlight glinting off of the jiggling windscreen of the Jeep. And Nova has come with them. They've had a child aboard the ship as they've been traveling for years. They've taught the child how to speak. Nova can speak a little bit now. And Nova and he and the child step out, and Nova screams. And he looks at the figure stepping out of the Jeep, and the last line of his narrative is, "He is a gorilla." That's awesome. What else is really cool is that the people reading the narrative finish the narrative, and the man turns to the woman on their vacation out there in this spaceship, the solar sail ship. He says, "What do you think of that?" And she's like, "That's preposterous. Who could ever believe that story?" And then in the end, again, double spoiler, but you know where this is going. She takes a makeup thing and pads her soft little muzzle with the makeup. So that's what Pierre Poule did in Planet of the Apes, the novel. And again, it's a great commentary on technology, laziness of people, developments, retardation of development, suppression through politics. It's really good. There's a lot of pressure on this character, especially in the trial scene. It's excellent. And how he turns from celebrity to realizing that his life is in danger. Great stuff. Pierre Poule knew how to do it. He was really good. But I want to tell you something else, and this has to do with the movie. So I read American Scriptwriter magazine for a long time. And I was out at a beach one time reading the magazine, and there was an article about how there was this debate about who wrote the final drafts of the original Planet of the Apes film, which was released in 1968, but shot in the year and a half before that. But the script was written years before that by various people. It took a lot of rewrites. And if you look at the script, it's got dual credit. Rod Serling and a guy named Paul Dehn, D-I-E-H-N, Paul Dehn. And Dehn ended up writing most of the other stories, creating the real cool time paradoxes and stuff that work all through it. And it really established the film. It was terrific the way that they worked that. It was excellent. So he said that there was this controversy. Who wrote that final iconic shot? Well, this guy who wrote the article said, "I've gone to the Ithaca library where they have the Rod Serling library. They've got his Oscars. They've got his Emmys. They're all on display. I've seen them, for what's that, what that means for people, whatever. They have his original scripts. They have his entire library there from what they were able to get, right? And his family lives, his kids live in the area. His wife moved back that way. She used to live out in Pacific Palisades for a while. She passed away a couple of years ago. But this guy said, I can definitively say that some people say that Rod Serling did not write that final scene for Planet of the Apes, that shocker of a scene, which was shot incredibly wisely. The direction on that film is stunning. And in fact, in the opening of my Liberty Conspiracy show, you can see, I show a shot from the cornfield when you first see the apes, when they're hunting down the humans in the cornfield. And that shot changed everything in films from that point on. A lot of other things changed things, but there's a whip pan to an ape on horseback that you see, and it goes right to left as the ape travels right to left. And then they do a quick cut, and you're closer to the ape as he turns, and it's an ape on the horseback. At this point, you've only seen the horses chasing the humans through the cornfield. And you hear a horn, which is their hunting horn, that incredible. Jerry Goldsmith's theme was amazing. He used all sorts of instruments to make it sort of organic sounding, a very different, nobody had done anything like that before in films. That was one of the greatest film soundtracks ever created. Just genius. And like I said, my dad sat next to Jerry Goldsmith on a plane one time. Goldsmith and Goldsmith's pretty interesting. They're not related. But that shot I put into my Liberty Conspiracy theme specifically because that affected me so much. That was one of the major reasons why I wanted to get into filmmaking. Just that split-second shot changed so much of my life right there. It is one of the most important shots in all of film history. And what they did in the film, in being able to depict the ending and keep it secret, was incredible, which again is why Fox did such a disservice to people who had never seen the film, right? And everybody wondered who came up with the ending. Was it Rod Serling who wrote the original drafts, or was it Paul Dean who finished the film? Well, this writer said, I found it. I've got the definitive proof in this article he wrote for American Screenwriter. He said it was Rod Serling. I'll show you. Here is his draft from January of 1963. Originally, the character of Taylor with the rescuing apes who help him escape with Nova. They're getting chased by the gorillas and Dr. Zaius, who doesn't want the secret to come out about the planet and what had happened to the humans there, which is, slightly different in the movie because it's warfare and things like that. But the ending that Rod Serling, they said that he originally wrote, was that they find a human graveyard. And that tells him that he's actually been, here's the mega spoiler, of course, on Earth the whole time. So a lot of people said it was Paul Dean who came up with the ending. Well, this man said, no, I've got the January script where Rod Serling changed it from the human graveyard to the Statue of Liberty, half buried in the sand. So there are a couple things that I can mention to you. First of all, one of the greatest biographies that I've ever read is this, Serling, by Gordon R. Sander. Okay, so remember that. When I went to, so after I read that article, I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'm so glad I know that. That's awesome. A couple years later, my friend Larry Poss, who did multiple tours to Vietnam, he was one of those guys they called the swimmers, where they would launch them from torpedo tubes to bring secret messages off the coast into Vietnam. And he's the one who carried a 35 millimeter camera with him. And he had an extra ammo belt, and he kept his rolls of film on it. And he showed me slides from his time in Vietnam. And he's like, you could see guys sitting around in some boxes in the jungle. He says, yeah, see that dude? See my buddy over there? The guy was reading a Playboy magazine. I was like, yeah. And he goes, yeah, he was shot about a minute and a half after I took that picture. He's shot in the head. He said there were snipers, and he showed me the next picture. He goes, there were snipers just past this rice paddy down in that line of trees. I was like, it just looks so beautiful. It looks gorgeous. It just looks like a place you'd be looking at. And he goes, I know. It was amazing. He goes, the other thing that he mentioned was that the Vietnamese would they would lay tiger traps for people. But he said the key thing about the tiger traps was that they didn't want to kill people with the bamboo that they would cut and, they'd layer stuff over in the paths. They didn't want to kill the American soldiers. They would smear them with human feces so that when the guys fell on the sharp bamboo, they'd get infected with E. coli. And then he said, killing one guy, they could just bury that guy. But if a guy gets infected and hurt, that then takes at least one or maybe two other guys to take him out of the jungle. So he said the Vietnamese were very crafty with that sort of stuff and laying wires and all sorts of stuff. And Larry, literally his father passed away. He came back to the States. Then he went back to Vietnam for another tour, one more final tour. Not a 3-hour tour, unfortunately. So we've got this debate, and it seems resolved by this guy who went to the library at Ithaca and got the Rod Serling script. Okay. So that's super cool. Larry Poss gives me, Larry's a massive, he has more horror novels than I could ever count. He had a table made of horror novels with glass on top of it. And he would change off the covers every once in a while, sort of like paperbacks from hell. He had them all on display. Great guy. Larry's such a good guy. And so Larry gave me his entire library of Amazing Stories magazines. Those little, like Isaac Asimov's magazine, like 8 inches by 5 inch magazines where so many people got their starts. Asimov, Heinlein, John Jakes, all these great writers, right? So that was the golden age of science fiction. I'm going through the copies, and there's a whole nother story about Twilight Zone magazine that I'll tell you later when I start talking about Twilight Zone magazine, some of the great writers who were there, and the weird Twilight Zone thing that happened to me about completing my collection. But I'm going through it, and I see this. So let me show you right here. I'm like, what is that? That's the February edition, 1963, of Amazing Stories magazine that Larry gave to me. I couldn't find the hard copy. I'll see if I can dig it up somewhere. February. Now remember, the old periodicals, they would have the month that was listed on the cover as the month for changeover for the local retailers to pull those off. When it got to be February, they're supposed to pull those magazines off the shelves and put up the new ones. So the next one would be March, covering the month of February, and then it would be taken off in March. That magazine was on the newsstands when Rod Serling changed the ending of Planet of the Apes. And if you're only listening in audio, it's an artist depiction by a guy named Alex Schumberter, I think, of a story by John Brunner, another great writer, called Bridge to Azrael. And it is the Statue of Liberty half buried in the sand with astronauts standing in front of it. So I knew where Rod Serling got his inspiration. He either had a subscription to the magazine or he saw it at the newsstand on the rotating rack. And that led to the inspiration of the greatest ending of all film, in my opinion. Except for, well, Blade Runner's got one that's also pretty darn awesome, and Psycho's pretty good too. That right there. So I knew. And I'm like, I think I'm the only person who knows. And I told Larry, I was like, Larry, look at this. And he goes, oh my God, you're right. I was like, Larry, I know that Rod Serling changed it that month. I don't think anybody else has put this together. I wonder if the author of that article knows. So I wanted to try to write to the author of the article, and then I couldn't find the magazine anymore, and the magazine ended up ending a few years after that. So I never got to tell him. Okay. Now we move to the 50th anniversary of Twilight Zone. I'm in Ithaca. And the person who sort of heads up the Rod Serling library is there, and he's telling us all about this. He organized everything. George Clayton Johnson is there. Mrs. Serling, Rod's daughters, Ann and Jody, are there. And there's a ton of us who are there. And it's awesome. I get to be friends with George Clayton Johnson. The minute I told him I was an anarchist, a voluntarist, he grabs my arm and he goes, me too. We got to talk. And we sat there talking. He gave me his home phone number. We would talk every couple of weeks on the phone. George Clayton Johnson, right? Co-writer of Logan's Run with my other friend, Bill Nolan, who just passed away a couple of years ago. And Bill, what a great guy. What a great guy. Wrote Twilight Zone stories, both of those guys, right? Kick the Can, bunch of those things. So there's so much to talk about those writers and what wonderful people they were, not just their creative powers and the examples and the ways that they can teach us if we'll want to go a certain direction in writing or anything like that. But they were super close friends. They were all friends with folks like Richard Matheson, and I've become friends with his son, R.C., who's a great guy. And they would get together out in California because they had all moved out there, and they were called the California, what they call the California crew or the California whatever. So it was Richard Matheson, sometimes Robert Bloch, sometimes Ray Bradbury, but mostly Matheson, Bill Nolan, sometimes Rod Serling, but mostly Matheson, Bill Nolan, George Clayton Johnson, and also I think later Harlan Ellison was sort of hanging out with those guys. But at the Twilight Zone time, they would get together when the Twilight Zone was on, usually at Richard's house, and they would watch Twilight Zone together. And it was great, like watch the story that they had written, or one of them had written. So, Talking Tina and Nightmare at 30,000 Feet and all that stuff, right? So what's curious about that is it's the end. It is literally 50 years to the day that Twilight Zone debuted. They're putting on the episode starring Earl Hallam in Where Is Everybody? The debut. Mrs. Serling and the kids are in the audience with George Clayton Johnson 50 years decades after Mr. Serling passed away, unfortunately. He was only 54, I think. One of his daughters was, I think, 17 years old. Right. And that's what really gets you is you see these people, you see this black and white icon most of the time, except for Night Gallery, that was in color, of Rod Serling, or maybe an interview with Dick Cavett or something like that. But mostly that black and white icon of Rod Serling. And, that sort of, you're about to enter a fifth dimension. No one of time and space, and the cigarette and everything, and the black tie. And then you meet his family, and you say, oh, it is, losing their father and her husband, and how they were childhood sweethearts. Makes me think of Thomas Massey and what he's gone through the past couple of years. Really, just it makes everything human, and it strips off the artifice of that tube and the broadcasting waves and the production and all those things. And you realize these are people. Rod Serling was just a guy trying to make his living for his family. That's what he was. And he had talent. So it's a shame that they lost their father that way. He was a pretty remarkable guy. But I have to drive home. I'm with my girlfriend, and we're getting ready to go. And I have to drive back because I have to work the next day. I don't know how many hour drive it was. 6 hours, something like that. And so we get back in the car, and we're out in the parking lot at Ithaca College. I said, oh, Courtney, hold on a second. I want to go back in and thank so-and-so who organized all this. So I go in, and he's just outside the door where they're showing another episode. And it's, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. And I said, I'm so glad I caught you. I just want to thank you so much for what you did. I came back, the car, the engine's running and stuff, but I couldn't leave without thanking you and doing what you did. He even played us the audio of Rod Serling in his hospital room, something that they wouldn't allow the public. They didn't allow anybody else but a small group of us in to listen. And his wife was there as he was recording after he had his heart surgery. And then he ended up having a heart attack after that, and he died. He smoked like crazy. He died after that. But it was an amazing thing. He asked for a recording device so he could dictate into it. And it was a message to this man who was a professor there. And he was getting ready to retire at this time when we were there. And he sent a message to him. And you can hear Rod Serling's voice from his hospital bed. And the alacrity and the diction and the pure intellectual prowess of that man, even so exhausted after having open heart surgery. He says, well, the first thing I can reveal to you is the utter exhaustion of what I'm feeling right now. It's as if, and then he goes into this amazingly colorful way to describe it. You're just like, dude, how do you do that? He was a unique person. That's for sure. Everybody's unique, but in that field, use of words. And read the short story collections Rod Serling has done of many of the Twilight Zone books. They have the Twilight Zone scripts because he got permission to write short stories of them. And it's just amazing. The guy was such a wordsmith. So he said, oh, thank you so much. Thanks, the man who organized it. Thank you so much. I said, there are a couple things that I realized. First, if you see the movie, you know that one of the big breakthroughs for the guys who land on the planet, the astronauts, is that they're wandering in the desert. They only have a certain amount of provisions. And finally, they find a waterfall. And that's the first sign. It's a waterfall. Wow, we're going to live, right? Well, if you go to Ithaca and you go past the entrance to Ithaca west on the road that runs east-west, if you go east, it goes towards Cornell. You go down this hill, and there's an entrance for Cornell University. There's a great Indian restaurant just down at the bottom of the hill. And the main portion of Ithaca is down at the basin. There's a Barnes & Noble down there. One of the Finger Lakes and stuff starts up there. And the Serling house was actually just on part of that lake up in a nice woodsy area up there. But if you travel west, the whole place, as you know, that whole area, it's all waterfalls. And there's one waterfall. When you go there and you see this waterfall, it's just up the road, maybe about a mile, maybe 3 miles up the road. You take a left, so you're heading sort of south from going west. And you go down, you go up this twisty, turning, a little bit of a hill, not much. It's very, very pretty. It reminds you of England a little bit. It's a lot of green with a lot of deciduous trees and things like that nearby. And there's a lot of space between the tree limbs and the greenery. It reminds me a lot of like, going to some of the countryside in England. But you see this waterfall, you're like, I know. When I was a kid, I always tried to figure out where is Ape City, because they land somewhere in the desert in the Forbidden Zone, and then they travel. And he explains to Cornelius and Zira through sign language when they're talking to Taylor. He says many days and nights hike, and he goes across this map. And I used to, when I was a kid, I would draw the maps. I would try to figure it out. That's how I got into. That's why I wanted to get into astrophysics. I got into Einstein's theories of relativity when I was like 9. I'd sit there and stare at the ceiling and try to think about E equals MC squared and all this different stuff. And but as far as that went, I used to try to figure out, where is Ape City? It's Binghamton, New York. It's his hometown. That's where Ape City is. So all the stuff, and of course they shot it out in California, but the idea is Ape City is Rod Serling's hometown. And if you go to Binghamton, you'll also see that they have preserved a merry-go-round there, which is also the basis for a story from one of the most famous stories from the Twilight Zone, about a guy who goes back to see himself as a child. And it's Binghamton. And so I said, I figured out there are a couple things I got to tell you. First of all, I know where Ape City is. And he's like, what? I was like, yeah, Planet of the Apes. He goes, yeah. I was like, Ape City is Binghamton. And he's like, you're right. I was like, yeah, it's Binghamton, New York. That's how many days it would take to hike from where you find the Statue of Liberty to this place. If you go northwest, you get to Binghamton. He's like, that's right. I was like, yeah. And I said, the other thing is, a long time ago, I read an article about who came up with the classic ending of Planet of the Apes. And it was about it was like, the statue. And he said, I wrote that article. I was like, you wrote that article? He's like, yeah. And then I realized I'm talking to Gordon Sander. Gordon Sander, that's the dude from Ithaca. He's the guy. He was Rod Serling's friend. He's the guy for whom Rod Serling recorded that audio. He's the guy who wrote the article that proved to me that Rod Serling had written that iconic ending. So I said, I've been wanting to talk to you for years, dude, for like 20 years. He's like, why? I was like, because I read that article. Of course, that's how I found out, because you proved it. He says, yeah, the script's right here in the library. I was like, yeah, I never realized that this whole time. And I had gone to multiple. I had met him a couple times before. They had it every other year. The Rod Serling conference was every other year there. In fact, Doug Winter is the one who recommended it to me. And I mentioned how I got that horror anthology down in Washington at the Trover Bookshop. Doug Winter was the editor of that. It's called Prime Evil. It's one of the best anthologies ever. It's terrific. It has a short story called Night Flyer by Stephen King in it, one of his best short stories, which is a Kolchak pastiche, but he couldn't use Kolchak. So it's essentially Kolchak, but he couldn't use the name. So I said, I've been looking for you for 20 years, man. I wanted to write to you, but I couldn't reach you. I didn't know. And he's like, why? I said, I know why he was inspired to do that. He's like, what? I was like, a friend of mine gave me all of his copies of Amazing Stories magazine. And in the February edition of Amazing Stories magazine is a story by John Brunner. And the artwork on the cover is the statue half buried in the sand in a desert. He's like, are you serious? I was like, yeah. And he goes, of course. I was like, yeah, it was on the shelves when Rod Serling wrote the ending. He goes, that has to be it. He goes, I can't believe it. And you've been looking for me this whole time and you didn't know? I was like, no, I didn't know. I didn't know you were the guy who wrote that article. I didn't know you were the guy I never made the connection. He says, can you send me a copy of that? And I was like, sure, I'll scan it. I'll scan the image for you. And there it is. So I don't know if Gordon, I believe Gordon Sander has passed away. But again, if you want to get a couple great books, first, read Planet of the Apes, the original by Pierre Poule, the inspiration. Arthur P. Jacobs was amazed by this book. And it is right up there with 1984, with Anthem, with We by Zemyatin. By the way, if you get any of those classic books like the Zemyatin book, We, the Russian dissident book that was originally published in France, and then Orwell saw it and Ayn Rand saw it. Do not read the introduction to any classic piece of literature because they have spoilers in them and they'll ruin everything. Don't read them. That's what happened to me when I wanted to read We by Zemyatin. So check it out, and check out this biography by Gordon Sander because it is amazing. And you'll learn a lot about Rod Serling. He was really quite an amazing guy. So there you go. That's my story about everything of Planet of the Apes, except not really everything. I want to tell you one other thing. Another great piece, and I'll tell you the story about my communications with Charlton Heston later. But I want to show you this. This is a book called The Making of Planet of the Apes. It's got an introduction by Charlton Heston's son, Fraser. And all I have to say is this man, Charlton Heston, salt of the earth, pro-liberty, really pro-liberty. This is a man who understood not only the principles of self-defense with a firearm, he communicated with me. He did audiobooks on philosophy, talking about the world's great philosophers, written by some of the greatest libertarian writers in history, especially the most recent history, George H. Smith and others. And it has been a remarkable thing to make these connections as a person who has been interested in script writing and had, I won't say idols, but people before me who laid a path of excellence to which one could aspire. There's the co-pilots here. And I'm going to talk a lot more about those. So again, thank you for hopefully being interested in this. Check out Planet of the Apes. It's a great novel. That's one of my first suggestions. I know it's horror mayhem. We'll talk about another book on Friday, for Fiction Friday here on Liberty Conspiracy. And if you're watching the channel for former Star Trek writing fellow, let's build this into something really big, and we'll have a great time together. And with that, I'll end this segment on fiction as the co-pilot is here. And thank you all. Please tell people about the channel. Please subscribe. Tell as many people as you can, especially on the YouTube side, because I don't think I'm going to get censored by them, which is going to be pretty darn cool. I don't think I'm going to get copyright strikes, and I'm going to talk a lot about books and script writing and even kitty cats. So thanks, everybody. We'll close this off for this segment of the former Star Trek Writers Fellow. And I want to bring in our guest. Let's see. It looks like he's disconnected. Shoot. We'll bring you on tomorrow night, Yona. And in the meantime, I want to thank everybody for being here. We had someone who was going to join us on the show. But I will say, fare thee well. And thank you, everyone, for hanging out. I've got a bunch of David Knight music here I would love to play. God bless David Knight. God bless Rod Serling, Mrs. Serling. I'll tell you about her influence on me as a writer and many other writers, because she was the publisher of Twilight Zone magazine, and what I got to tell her about that. And I'll leave you with our outro.